Today, I'm presenting selected aspects drawn from my practice-based PhD, researching with over 100 people in the archipelagos of Orkney and Shetland, where I have lived and worked for extended periods over the last 3.5 years. What I share, because this is a limited presentation, can only be fragmentary and a partial reflection of the voices, knowledges, and experiences that were given into this research. One of the key aims of my PhD project has been to elicit and analyse the diverse ways in which Northern Isles communities connect around maritime pasts and futures, and how these connections interplay with learning for sustainability in still maritime environments. This presentation reflects on how mobilising the metaphor and geopoetics of the edge has been expanding my own research imagination and the epistemological parameters of the methodology and knowledge traditions that I have used to frame and practice this research. Heritage work and practices comprise interactions with and uses of nature culture expressions that people consciously and or unknowingly enact to define identities and for attaching, becoming and belonging with people and in places. They privilege only selected mediations. These selections of recalled, preserved, memorialised events, objects, archives, representations, sites, locations and features become baselines from which people in communities imagine and evaluate pasts, and also progress their concepts of development. They're moving forward, to use a currently popular phrase. This work is bound up in acts of memory, memoir, recollection and memorialization, in which some perceptions and ways of knowing must be forgotten and edged out in order that others might be edged in. At its simplest, this heritage work, as one participant in the research put it, is used to find out who we are, where we come from, and where we are going. At its most hegemonic, this selectivity can be used to reinforce narratives of exceptionalism, isolation, and dislocation. The anthropologist Anthony Cohen, following extensive fieldworking with fishers in Walsa, Shetland, has argued that for researchers like me, to understand how people in places respond to and or undertake their own development, deciding what edges will preserve and contain, and which edges are to be transgressed and dissolved, we researchers need to practice knowledge appropriateness, taking time to participate, to listen attentively, observing how to know the way that things are known locally, by people, in specific environments and social milieu. Philosopher Hannah Arendt has described such interpersonal disclosures in which people share and negotiate agency as spaces of appearance, the places and opportunities people make for revealing themselves to each other within webs of relations. These webs cross-cut meaning making and the underpinning of these meanings through people's processes of forming values. In this relationality, crossing between and or retreating from edges, people coming to know themselves and others in the places that they find themselves, as historical beings, with a present and with pasts. Their formation of values also influences how people use their present understanding of pasts for future forecasting or future assembling, as is proposed by Cockle and Harrison, respectively. When we have the concept that we are at the edge, experiencing change, acceleration, overwhelming, endangerment and or opportunities, what do we remember forward? Whose heritages are stitched into the sails that drive the narrative superstructures of community, region, nation and world, and which are left to flounder? The skills and knowledge appropriateness that is needed for these processes is akin to those that are used when navigating at sea, in the har of sea mists, between the almost grating fissures that are made into sea cliffs across a narrow geo. Agencies can become thwarted as they cross knowledge territories that, while they may be local, are also segmentary, or influence perhaps even imposed from out with or within. And this has been my interest, to observe alongside people in communities as they engage in one aspect of this edgy navigation, that is heritage-based development, eliciting and experimenting together experiences of social learning through caring for and using aspects of their heritages. This has been co-curating, as Dennis Burns suggests, to support fragile and tenacious desires for belonging in the world. The theoretical framework that I have used supports a transdisciplinary bricolage, including multi-sited and multiply phased fieldworking, iterative analysis and interpretation, and all is anchored lightly in and problematizing the emergent methodology of critical heritage studies, and also is in methods that generate and evaluate theory and action together in praxis. For the research practice, I have adapted and developed from Ulrich Köchel's definition of public ethnology as a contemporary anthropological methodology founded on action-focused fieldwork, observing what people do, and interpreting how and why they do it in and through their respective historicities and environmental contexts. All this towards demonstrating the progressiveness of many of their cultural traditions, and therefore challenging the interests behind the fixation of certain aspects of heritage work. The ethos has been that of undercommons working, defined by Harney and Moten as a with and for, studying with people rather than teaching them, moving away from the privilege of extending academic benevolence, flipping established ontological perspectives, mending across the seams of disparate methodologies, and fraying of knowledge and cognitive frames in an holistic approach that reflects Fiona Cameron's invitation to emerge new ways of thinking and acting, ecologizing heritage work, dissolving linear narratives of cause and effect, and mitigations that concentrate on stabilizing and preserving, rather encouraging new ecosystems of complex involvements, connecting the actions and agencies of many human, non-human, and worldly processes. In our present Anthropocene, the lived experiences of climate emergency, multiple coloniality, economic precarities, global conflicts, displacements, forced and urgent migrations, and the current pandemic, COVID-19, sustainability can be understood as an example of Antonio Gramsci's conceptualization of the conjunctural. This is the terrain upon which political and cultural interest holders compete over what and who can or should be sustained, and in turn what and whom these actions can actually sustain. Heritage appears to have become a key apparatus for governing this conjunctural. This idea of heritage as a discourse of power relations concerning how our culture natures are selectively represented, and that can be analysed through signs, signifiers and indices, is central to the now nominalised concept of an authorised heritage discourse, as first theorised by Laura Jane Smith in 2006. Similarly, there is competitive agonism between concepts and actions for sustainability, as is well demonstrated in the United Nations continuing deliberations over the relative rigidity or plasticity of edges between growth and sustainment, dissonance between cutting-edge developments for prosperous futures, and the edging out of fragile nature cultures, exploited, extracted and overused inequitably in order to attain such prosperity. These concerns were emphasised in the Brundtland Report published in 1987. Finding ways to solder the perceived fissures between concepts of sustainability and of development now forms the focus of the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, these one world approaches for rebalancing growth. The Shetland dialect word siwrmyl, describing the shifting where shore mingles with sea, has become for me an important metaphor in this research at the ebb, sifting to find not just what is known, but rather, as Cornelius Holtorf advises, how knowledge and experience of change and versions of pasts inform present decisions and shape growth. This sifting, reflecting on, and comparing what it is we do and what others do and what they have done and what meanings we make is a practice of own ethnology. This own ethnology is a way of knowing that has been well defined by Merleau-Ponty as thinking that demands that we transform ourselves in the betweenness both of experiencing our social milieu and of distancing from it. We become ethnologists of our own society. This transformative praxis resonates with Rodney Harrison's proposal that to study heritages critically, we must cultivate intimate distance. Getting perspective on heritage work and practices as this research, observing and experiencing edges as mutable and relational, has included examining the multivariate oscillations between centrality and peripherality in both Orkney and in Shetland. Shifts similar to those identified by Chris Whitehead in his theorisation of time and identity place-based heritages at multiple locations throughout Europe. Studying across two contrastive island groupings has required attentiveness to the differing, comparable and contrastive The criticality of the praxis was stimulated by my own ethnographic research, including interviewing 70 residents across the Isles concerning their perceptions of heritage, development, and sustainability in their islands. Lived experiences and anticipations of fragility, endangerment, and sensations of cultural loss akin to David Berliner's reading of this phenomenon as an experience of losing everything were prominent as people reflected on their island nature cultures, abraded by climate crisis, experiencing geopolitical peripheralization, economic openness, and sparse population levels, including high levels of youth out-migration, the in-migrations of new islanders, and increased rural to urban intra-migrating, and the pursuant changes in island lifeways. More specifically, numerous participants shared that these effects were compounded by national and regional governments' promotions of heritage development and associated funding strategies that led to perceived culture of project short-termism and, again, a perception of the privileging of authorised tourism-receptive pastiche of people and of places. At the crossroads of the North Atlantic and North Sea, the inhabitants of Orkney and of Shetland have complex geohistories and politics. Positioned both as hyperboreal edges, as 16th century courtier and sometime resident of Orkney, William Fowler described them, upon the utmost corners of the world, and also as centres and confluences for trade and diplomacy, strategic locations for imagined and actual continental empire extension by Romans, Vikings, and Scottish and British governance. The transfer of overarching governance of the Northern Isles from Norway to Scotland in 1472 marks the advent of their instrumentalisation as nodes in modernity's accelerations and accumulations through global trade and commerce. Provisioning ships and providing sea-skilled labourers into what Kehoe and Dalgleish, writing about similar trends in the Highlands, have called the British imperial environment. From an outsider's perspective, the signifiers of historic maritimity, promoted overtly and implicitly across the Northern Isles, are sticky with representations of a heritage of being at the centre of things. Often, when I asked to see local maritime heritage, I was directed to indices of maritime pasts, buildings, collections, monuments, and memorialisations incorporated over times into assemblages of what appeared to be what Atkinson, when writing about similar heritage-scaping in the seaports of Hull and Liverpool, characterised as a maritime kitsch aesthetic. Here is a decontextualised grammar. In interviews, critically listening to 25 heritage gatekeepers, people who are also members of their local communities in the Isles, I heard more particular perspectives on these heritages. For some, they signified the complexity of historic internal colonisation by absentee landowners, often identified to me as Scottish merchant lairds, who had engaged islanders in truck economy labouring towards industrialising fisheries and other marine extractions. The complexity was evident in the dissonance between people's telling to me of these heritages and then the heritage representations of Golden Age involvements of Orkney and Shetland residents and famed visitors, taking part, for example, in expeditions, industrial-scale whaling, and in maritime martial activities. What was emerging exemplifies what decolonial theorists Da Costa and Da Costa have recently defined as multiple coloniality. When considering what can be sustained and what is sustainable in the context of a 2030 agenda orienting world, in which, to quote the United Nations, no one should be left behind. Looking at the work that maritime heritages implicating Orkney and Shetland entanglements in the legacies of historic, environmental and social inequalities, internal, world-facing, and sometimes unknowing, has significance. This was something that was given serious reflection by many of those I interviewed, most of whom found themselves practicing between the edges of making heritage that is tourism receptive, while also curating with their own appropriate knowledges, knowing that these transnational narratives were also expressions of people-place lived experiences, of family histories and narratives of locales and of place-based institutions. Discerning what is critical here requires ethnological imagination, a concern with and for people, to critique productions of a peripheralizing continental gaze upon themselves and upon others. To paraphrase David Gange, these reifications of Oslo, Edinburgh and London-locked pasts localised world connectivity, but they are not particular. They affect exceptionalism and displacement, solidifying and edging out of nature cultures, taking place and replacing situated empathy and place-based wisdoms with what Ulrich Köchl argues is a cultural movement that, while it appears to idolise those that it styles as the folk, restricts them to the spaces designated for them by their hegemony. When I asked the heritage gatekeepers to share with me their imaginaries for curating more people-place, reflexive and empathetic heritages, they drew on their resources of research, knowledges and lived experiences happening in their own communities and in their own community-embedded actions, articulating ways of curating across institutionalised edges, between segmented experiences of elite and working people, across genders, and across social and natural histories, between pasts and present, across diverse expertise and experiences, between the both and of transnational heritages and personal, family, everyday histories, embodied and intangible, maritime expressions. They shared with me their concepts of maritime heritages as opportunities to highlight continuums in local practices of producing and recording knowledge, story and skill sharing, acknowledging fellow islanders as knowledge storers for making potential heritages that can resource, anticipating, adapting, renovating and renewing through crisis and through change. They also shared frustrations that these more people-place responsive ways of curating require resources and capacity that present income targeting and misrecognitions of what local heritages can be and can do not readily support. To nurture this expansion of ethnological imagining and the generative potential of dissonance, we widened participation into the next phase of the research, an 18-month series of group conversations and workshops in which heritage workers would share authority with fishers, marine renewable engineers, oil workers, planners, mariners, artists, boat builders, island board folk and new islanders, and many more, to begin our experiment of co-curating a new digital maritime museum. In these dialogues, including 2 6-week periods in which people deliberated at and in the ebb and flow, critically listening and sharing how their own and other situated and diverse knowledges and experiences shaped the values that they were forming around aspects of their heritages. Facilitating these deliberative value formations, inspired by the recent work of Jasper Kenter and colleagues, also elicited social learning about how forming values shapes behaviours and decision-making, and ultimately futures assembling. This was co-curating not as community engagement, nor by epistemic popularism, but through sharing authority in public ethnology, cross-cutting multiple local life worlds for knowing how to know about being people in the sea, and for knowing how to know about being in the Northern Isles and being in the world. Prominent themes during these initial dialogues reflected the participants' experiences of observing and being co-opted into the work of museumifying their maritimities, as if they were, as one participant put it, some endangered species of heritage. Many shared that such heritage work simplifies the contemporary social, political and economic relevance of the sea for island inhabitants, disengaging from the interplay between communities' identity building and the contested futures of their contemporary fisheries, marine renewable energy generation, and marine-based tourism. Those working in these occupations shared that transmission of maritime culture, including ecological awareness, still takes place here. Proposing these contemporary maritime occupations as future heritages also meant deliberating agonisms over the contested local sea spaces that they inhabit. Opening up to the possibility of incommensurability reinforced participants' perspectives on the need for such deliberations, to deliberate the dynamics of producing ecosystems of memory and the becoming of future heritages and their shaping of people and place. Considering how heritages express local futuring, participants connected around the need to maintain such dialogues, to share authority for mediating multi-temporal, multimodal and culturally plural ways of becoming and belonging through their heritage work. Examples of contemporary, creative, affective and embodied maritimity happening in music making, boat building, story sharing, photography, poetry, seafaring, and many other activities were also highlighted. Throughout, the co-curators were navigating the edgy straits of own ethnology, both being in the sifting edges of Shurmal, immersing in their actions and meaning making, and also stepping aside in spaces of appearance with each other to examine critically, knowing how to know together what it is that particular heritage making sustains, how it is connected to wider world making, and whether it is in itself sustainable. The following quoted extracts are partial yet representative fragments of the voicings expressed at these dialogues. Quote, "Can we afford to be islands when we can't access the natural resources because they're owned by somebody else? If skills have eroded, if there are no people to build up boats, to know where the fish are, and when the tides are about to catch. Unquote. And also, I feel that the present is weighed down by a focus on the past. It distorts the view of the present by people living in the community. It influences the continuance of their modern relationship with the sea. End quote. I think there are hard decisions to be made about what art heritage is and who we're preserving it for. For our experiment in virtual museum co-curating, filmmaking became a modality for mediating these critical own ethnologies, for embodying their affectivity, sharing present practices of cross-cutting roles, generations, knowledges, cultures and historicities, all for responding and adapting to environmental and social milieu, climate change abrasions, multiple migrations, and other people-place processes of change, for knowing appropriately and anticipating and assembling the futures that people want to become into and belong to. Filming and editing introduced its own problematics. We had dialogues together and with critical friends across the communities about the liabilities for romanticising and for strategic essentialism. Should the music that is part of quotidian life in each archipelago be used as a soundtrack for the films? What would this intimate? Should dialects be subtitled? These deliberations were shared learnings, collaboratively reflecting on how values can and might be formed around the films, as new and future heritage objects themselves. The co-curators shared responsibility for the conceptual and affective depth of these modalities, seeing them and the other aspects of the virtual museum as instruments for those living in the islands to access the particularities of their own ethnologies, and to extend their understanding of the work that these do when they are set adrift in the world. Stepping from sea to shore, between ways of seeing, they open up the potential of intergenerational and intercommunal transmission as resources for thinking about who makes heritage, for whom, and to what effects, both in the intimacy of the locale and out into the world. These exemplify what Cockle and McCullagh have termed reflexive traditions, resources for sustainment, not stasis. This work of people engaging critically with the possibility that they, today, are future heritage making, and understanding what this can do, resonates with Ariella Azule's recent thesis for initiating global repair. Azule advocates unlearning of the temporal, spatial, and embodied politics of imperialism through researching and communicating potential histories, connecting previously segmented populations across times and across places in the world, and abjuring ideas of progression that edge in or edge out diverse pasts through pastiche heritages that stultify continuum, possibility, and change. I'm ending the presentation now with 2 excerpts from the 7 films that we made. In these, Sarah Jane Gibbon in Orkney and Eilish Parham in Shetland share their own ethnologies, their critical heritage practices, placing themselves as active allies in continuum, a carrying ebb and flow of knowing the pasts of their people places, of repudiating the separation of these pasts from present agency, and of resisting the authorised discourse of presenting heritage as an apolitical instrument. They are apprehending the critical conjuncture from which imagination and empathy can expand, transgressing edges to move from narratives of endangerment to renovation in ways that are both exceptional to place and people, and also connected and enmeshed in relations of interdependence, always bearing responsibilities with and for others, and always archipelago worlding.
Rugged western shore, look down into the deep. Well, I was commissioned to write the song by a local group here, the Bursey Drama Group, who were putting on a foy to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the loss of the Hampshire, which happened just off the coast here. Underneath the waves it's calm, a ship lies sleeping in the sand, forever wrapped in watery arms, a hidden grave. Been coming back and forth to this shore over the years, and at different times of year and for different occasions. So as a bairn coming to play down on the sand and play at the huts here, and then as a teenager coming up here with a boyfriend to walk and watch the sunset, and even doing that more recently with my husband. So there's lots of different memories that I have for this piece of coast. The night as lovers kiss on cliff top high, an evening stroll in winter time, warm holding hands. It's a timeless piece of coast, and it holds memories for everybody. And although the Hampshire was the focus of the song, I kind of wanted to explore the fact that this coast is more than just that. And although it has sadness attached, it has all these other emotions too. When I'm asked to write a piece, I have to find a personal connection to it, because I think it's much more honest that way. Green, the grass is warm. As an archaeologist, I understand the passing of time, and it's something I'm very interested in. I always store within my head that idea of the footsteps of the folk that have gone before us, and how many different people have walked here and lived here, fished from here, how many other people have died in this coast. So it's much, much more than a single event. We look down under the sea at the Hampshire, but then we're looking up into that wide sky, as so many folk have done, in happy memories. Fishermen with supper caught, row to shore in peaty boat, nearly coop their load, but not, 'cause for their tea. This is one of the most fertile spots on the west mainland of Orkney, and we have a Norse farmstead just along the coast. We have a chapel, we have a broch, we have stories of giants. They're all there, just at this piece of coast. And so it was to try and get that into the song too, that feeling of time. What do you see? We're looking out over that waves and minding on that folk make a living on the sea. They're all using this piece of coast, and they all have different perceptions of it. And really that's what the song's trying to express. Sand, forever wrapped in watery arms, a hidden grave, rugged western shore abound.
Maritime heritage has always kind of been in my blood. My parents both aren't from here, but my father was and still is heavily involved in fishing. So I've always grown up around boats, but never really sailing. I went on the Swan for 2 weeks as part of sail training Shetland, and just fell in love with sailing, not just sailing in general, but the boat, the history of the boat. I would consider myself a Shetlander now, I think, but growing up and not having Shetland parents, first of all, sailing was kind of something that enabled me to connect with the people in Shetland, because it's so obvious and apparent that sailing is completely part of Shetland's history and heritage. That was kind of the first thing that connected me to the past, and I kind of grasped that and leapt on it and was like, oh, that is so cool. I really imagined what it was like for these people to go and be on a boat like this and work on a boat and live on a boat and this be their complete livelihood. It was amazing. We're sailing the boat together because without us working together and getting on with each other, then we wouldn't be able to go anywhere. I had been travelling through sailing as well, and I came back not really knowing what I wanted to do. I got a job here at the museum, and it was actually in the archives. There was just a pamphlet advertising the culture and heritage degree, and I just thought, that sounds really cool. I'll go and do that. Things kind of came together, and I realised that I was one of a minority who was just kind of coming into things and having a passion about maritime heritage and people mainly, and realising that it was actually quite important to me. There's still people who maybe only have another 20 or 30 years to be able to pass on what they know. For me, the main progression would be in passing on different skills and just thoughts and the way of life through sailing and things. I have kind of obligation to keep doing what I'm doing and hopefully, make sure that things like the Vela May are continued, and it's about the people and about the passing on of skills and those kind of things. It connects you maybe slightly more because people who are involved with other sectors of the maritime industry, the technology has developed so much, whereas with sailing, I think things haven't really changed. You are doing something which was probably quite similar to how people were doing it 100 years ago. More, you still pull on ropes, you still raise the gaff, you still raise the yard, you still do all those things, which was exactly the same.